thanks to all the co-sponsors and to everyone who worked to make this event possible. I know that it's always a lot of work and effort when you have many other things to do, so I really do appreciate it. And this is, for me, almost the end of a long tour of which will be 10 days. This is day 8, which has taken me to Western Canada, to Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Victoria, to Eugene and Portland and Spokane, and today Seattle and tomorrow Olympia. And I've been on an airplane every day and sometimes spoken twice a day. So I'm almost at the point where I can't bear to hear myself anymore, but I appreciate you coming. Well, this sort of the immediate impetus for this tour was Israeli Apartheid Week, and I just put up the electronic Intifada to show off some of the beautiful artwork by a young artist called Nidal El-Khairi, Palestinian artist who lives in Jordan. Actually, you can, there's a whole little animation there, I think. Might as well enjoy it. But Israeli Apartheid Week now is held all over the world in dozens of college campuses and has become quite a big event. And of course, some of the pro-Israel groups are very unhappy about this. And I'm going to put up that site now that has the terrible music. Let's see, we have to have the terrible music or we don't have the whole effect. Let's see. There we go. Okay, I'll turn off the terrible music, but you get the idea. So this is actually a Canadian site. You heard the music, you see the images, and this is really a projection of what Israel wants you to think about it. It's a country of rock concerts and of Arab towns that you look at from a great distance, and surfing, and guys in dreadlocks who go backpacking in Thailand, and women. And if you click around the site, it tells you all the wonderful things about Israel. Biotechnology, medical technology, medical devices, all sorts of things, life-saving treatments, steam and gas autoclaves. These are all important things. So high technology there. Let's have a look here. The environment. The environment is very important. Irrigation systems, water efficiency, all very important now. Desalination, reuse of water. The Jewish National Fund has planted 240 million trees. Let's say 240 billion trees. Why minimize it? Israel is the only country in the world that has seen an increase in the number of trees. So alternative energy, 2 companies here. Solel is one, and Better Place is another that they talk up a lot. Let's take a look here. Big diversity. You know, the music is still running. I just muted it. See? No, it's not. I thought it was. Okay, so here you see 80% of Israelis are Jewish, but they're very diverse. There are tribes from the Andes, from India, from all over the place. Every color and flavor of Jew that's available. And then, of course, 20% of Israelis are non-Jews. And you can see here the message of religious groups, of Arab Israelis. They would call themselves Palestinian citizens of Israel, but Arab Israelis who serve in the Knesset. And Miss Israel was a Palestinian woman. Israel is now home to people from over 70 countries. Women's rights, Golda Meir, and so on. I have actually never looked at the tab that says big diversity, so we're going to do that for the first. Oh, big pride. Although, if you watch the video that accompanies this website, has anyone seen it? Yeah. Or it's not about big pride. They actually took it off the website, but you can find it on YouTube. So, gay rights. So this is all, you know, how progressive Israel is with gay rights. So all of this is designed to send a message of Israel as a place of beauty, diversity, liberalism, and all these wonderful things. But there are things they don't tell you that are, I think, just as much worth knowing. And for example, in the field of women's rights, this is a story that struck me recently from Haaretz. This is about the IDF's newest heroes. So this story is really talking it up. But if you read it, it's about 18 and 19-year-old women staring at black and white screens that show what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And they're operating, it turns out, remote control heavy machine guns that fire into the Gaza Strip. So this is considered to be a blow for women's rights. And you have to think about what creates that space of, I love this, so I'm going to show it again. Oh, it didn't go through all the images. But what creates that space? What creates that space of beauty and liberalism is a system of policing and controlling the native population, literally keeping them in a fenced enclosure, controlled by remote-controlled machine guns operated from video screens. So that's exactly the other side of the liberal image that is portrayed. Now, of course, whenever asked, the Israelis say that, well, we are patrolling the border of Gaza because of the terror, the terrorists, and the militants and the gunmen. Of course, in that Haaretz story, it actually says that they can't really tell what they're looking at, and so these women often have to sort of argue with the commanders about what they're actually seeing on the video screen, because it's just a video screen. They can't tell what the people are before they fire the automatic machine guns. Well, this is an example of what does happen when Israel fires indiscriminately into the Gaza Strip. This is a story that the Electronic Intifada published in January about a young man who was recalling the day his friends were killed 2 years ago. And he described what happened to them. 23rd of February 2008 is etched in Hamad's memory. His is a story of seeking a sanctuary where politics, occupation, siege, and Israeli attacks didn't exist, just friends, tea, tobacco, water pipe, and talk. He relives the next painful minutes in slow motion. Then it was exactly 2:28 p.m. There was a huge explosion and much smoke. I couldn't see the area where they'd been standing. The smoke was so thick. when I finally got through the smoke and reached where they'd been standing, this was his 3 friends, I found only pieces of my friends. I couldn't identify them by their faces. They were so destroyed. And he goes on, we collected my friends in pieces and took them to the hospital. Talks about life in the 2 years since that happened. This happens quite regularly. Just a few weeks ago, a young man was shot over the border and killed by the Israeli army. And what they have in common is that often they are farmers. In this case, they were on family land. They weren't actually farming. The friends were just gathering to drink tea and have a smoke when they were hit. But since Israel's attack on the Gaza Strip, which began on December 27, 2008, there has been, of course, you know some of the numbers, and we may talk about that. 1,400 people were killed, the vast majority of them civilians. Can you hear? Again, I want you to keep in mind the Israel that's presented to us of this beautiful, wonderful, liberal space, and think about the situation in Gaza from the perspective of the people on the other side of the remote-controlled machine guns. Since the attack on Gaza, Israel has systematically, or during and after the attack, systematically worked to undermine any kind of self-sufficiency of people in Gaza. Remember the boasting about the irrigation systems and the water use in Israeli agriculture. One of the things that has been so underreported about the situation in Gaza is the systematic destruction during Israel's attack of the agricultural sector. And this has taken place in a number of ways. First of all, the declaration of a 300-meter zone around the edge of the Gaza Strip in which, if you enter it, you die. And in practice, this extends much more than 300 meters. It extends about 2 kilometers, a mile and a half. And so it takes up about a third of the agricultural land in Gaza. The UNDP, a UNDP survey after the attacks found that 14,000 dunams, 1 dunam is 1,000 square meters, of irrigation networks and pipes had been systematically destroyed, along with 250 wells, 327 water pumps destroyed, and another 53 partially damaged by Israeli bombing and bulldozing. 35,000 chickens were killed, targeted. Livestock was deliberately attacked and destroyed. And of course, farmers. So just these deaths occurred in February 2008. In February 2009, another farmer, Muhammad al-Ibrim, age 20, was working with other laborers 500 meters from the border when Israeli soldiers began shooting at them, and he was shot in the ankle. But just 2 weeks before, his cousin Anwar had been shot in the neck and killed, leaving behind 2 children. What this tells, I think, is a very different story of a systematic effort to, first of all, remove the indigenous people from the land, to confine them in what is effectively a giant prison in Gaza, and then to undermine any possibility or capacity for them to have any kind of sustainable life. So in addition to destroying the agricultural sector, of course, Gaza is under a complete blockade. So people have to dig tunnels in order to get basic necessities. The Israeli Army spokesman's office issues boastful press releases about we allowed in 170 trucks of humanitarian supplies today, or we allowed this, we allowed that, as if Israel is providing it. Israel is not providing it. Israel has reduced the population of Gaza, which was largely self-sufficient, to dependence on United Nations rations. And then after reducing them to dependence on United Nations rations, it cuts off the free entry of food and other necessities and turns the spigot on and off with fuel, with electricity, with food, with textbooks, with everything, in order to keep the native population under control. That is the price of the dreadlocked young Israelis. That's the price of their opportunity. They have the opportunity to live this life because Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the camps of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and elsewhere, are denied those opportunities. So Israel is sort of like a Jekyll and Hyde state, where not Jekyll and Hyde, I'm thinking of Dorian Gray, the picture of Dorian Gray. Jekyll and Hyde too, but I really thought the picture of Dorian Gray is a good metaphor for the image that Israel is trying to project, youth and beauty. But in the closet is a picture which gets older and uglier as the sins and the atrocities mount. And I thought that was really quite striking when you juxtapose the images that are being disseminated on campuses. And here, with this size doesn't matter campaign, what's so interesting is that it's targeted at Generation O, the Obama generation, who are supposed to care about the environment and about gay rights and about all these wonderful liberal things. And so it's an attempt to greenwash and gaywash a situation that really cannot simply be hidden behind this kind of propaganda. Where does this take us? I've talked about Gaza, where out of 640 schools in the Gaza Strip, 18 were completely destroyed and 280 damaged by the Israeli bombing last year. So half the schools in Gaza were hit. And a similar percentage of health clinics, 46% were hit, according to the UN. And you listen to Israeli officials like Gabriela Shalev, the ambassador at the United Nations, who talks about, and I quote her, the Palestinians' cynical use of schools, hospitals, and mosques as weapons of terror. That was a statement she made in the United Nations a few days ago. And I think we've reached, in a sense, a breaking point between the image that Israel wants to project and the reality that can no longer be concealed, can no longer simply be brushed under the carpet. And this is something that, of course, Israel itself has noticed. And you may have heard or read, we published on the electronic Intifada an expose of a report issued by the Reut Institute, Israel's leading think tank, very influential. They actually held a special cabinet meeting about this report, which made the following observation, that Israel's traditional strategic doctrine, which views threats to the state in primarily military terms, and therefore the response in primarily military terms, so we have to have the strongest army, the strongest air force, and so on. We have to have the technological edge, the qualitative edge, is out of date. That rather what Israel faces today is the threat of delegitimization. that the very idea of a Jewish state is now being widely questioned, that it's now become legitimate, in a sense, to question the whole premise of a Jewish state. They talk in quite conspiratorial terms. They talk about the Reut Institute I'm referring to. They talk about a resistance network, which is basically groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that engage in asymmetric warfare against Israel, and whose goal is not to bring about defeat of Israel on the battlefield. They know that will, never happen when there's such a huge power imbalance, but to cause the implosion of the state of Israel from within, very much like apartheid South Africa or East Germany or the Soviet Union. And then accompanying this resistance network, and in unholy alliance with it, according to the Reut Institute, is something called the delegitimization network. This is made up of the broad and growing movement of peace and justice, human rights activists, the growing movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and they specifically mention Israeli Apartheid Week as a phenomenon of this. This is happening primarily in certain hubs that they name. It's more broad, but they mention certain hubs which include London, Madrid, Toronto, New York, I believe, and the San Francisco Bay Area. No, New York is not mentioned, interestingly. I'm considering an appeal to the Reut Institute on the basis that I feel that Chicago is overlooked. And we deserve it, especially after not winning the Olympic bid in 2016. Well, actually, we were happy about that. But I really feel we worked hard for this one. And maybe it'll just encourage some healthy competition for next year's Reut Institute Delegitimization Hub Awards. The other element, of course, that they identify as being part of the delegitimization strategy is what they call lawfare, the use of the law to hold alleged Israeli war criminals to account. And of course, most people in the world think that the rule of law and the application of the law is a good thing. Israel considers it, to use the words of the Reut Institute, an existential threat. One, of course, there have been a number of efforts. I won't go through them, but one in particular that struck me as quite significant, which was the issuance of an arrest warrant for Tzipi Livni, who was a foreign minister at the time of the attack on Gaza, a few months ago by a magistrate judge in London who believed that she was in the UK or imminently about to arrive. And it seems, what we know, she was tipped off, she cancelled her trip, she avoided arrest, and Israel was very angry. UK officials were very apologetic and said, we're very sorry, and you should be able to come here freely, and we'll change the law, and, all of that. But nevertheless, I think this is very important, and that arrest warrant may well have saved countless lives. And here's why. Because for the first time in history, and I think that's the first time an arrest warrant has ever been issued for an Israeli leader for crimes alleged to have been committed against Palestinians, Lebanese, other Arabs. For the first time in history now, Israeli leaders have to take their own personal fate into account when they give the orders. So that arrest warrant, however fleeting it was, may well have been life-saving. And now Tzipi Livni cannot visit the UK. It's a start. Other Israeli leaders, too, find themselves unable to travel freely. Whether or not the British will rush to change the law, after the discovery of identity theft on a massive scale by Israel of British citizens' passports in order to commit acts of murder in Dubai remains to be seen. I think Israel will have a harder time convincing people that its leaders should be immune. So the combination of lawfare and activism presents, according to the Reut Institute, it possesses strategic significance and may develop into a comprehensive existential threat within a few years. And it also warns that a harbinger of such a threat would be the collapse of the two-state solution as an agreed framework for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the coalescence behind a one-state solution as a new alternative framework. Now, this is, I think, very significant. When I wrote this book, and I'm sorry there aren't copies here, it languished for a couple of years, and all of a sudden, just as we were planning this tour, there was a rush on it, and the publisher said, it's out of stock and we're reprinting it. I don't know what that says. That's good news for me, but it means that we don't have any copies here. But I think it also potentially says something about the moment we're in, because when it first came out, and I was in a rush to get it out, I thought, oh, you know, if I don't get it out right away, it's going to be too late. And it was much too early. When it first came out, nobody really wanted to talk much about it. There were a few activists who were quite enthusiastic about the idea. But one of the things I predicted was that within a few years, the moment would come, and I was off, I think, by a couple of years. I thought it would happen earlier than it did. That within a few years, there would be widespread recognition that a two-state solution is impossible, that there is no such thing. It's a nice idea. It's a comforting idea that, you know, we have two groups of people and they don't like each other, so we'll put one group in one box and another group in another box, and that will solve the problem. I think we've now reached that moment of widespread recognition, but people haven't yet coalesced around an alternative. There's too much uncertainty about whether the alternatives are viable. How could you get to a peaceful transition to a single state in which Israelis and Palestinians have equal rights? Aren't the obstacles so great that it couldn't happen? I've argued for some time that there are reasonable models that we can turn to. Of course, South Africa is perhaps the best known example of a transition from settler-native dynamic and minority rule to a one-person, one-vote system. But Northern Ireland, I've long argued, has a similar dynamic to Palestine-Israel in that the conflict originates with a settler invasion and then the imposition of a system in which the indigenous people, after being expelled and displaced, are subjected to what is in effect an apartheid regime. What they called in Northern Ireland a Protestant state for a Protestant people, which obviously disenfranchised the indigenous and largely Catholic Irish nationalist community. But there you have now a system that is fits under the model of consociational democracy, in which you have a power-sharing government that is, in a sense, the political equivalent of a coalition between Hamas and the Likud party of Netanyahu. It's hard to imagine that, and it always raises a chuckle. But in political terms, that is the transformation that occurred in Northern Ireland. And so far, it seems to be working in the sense that there are now mechanisms for people to resolve political differences without a resort to violence. So these models exist, and one could talk about them dispassionately and say, well, what might work in a Palestine-Israel context? But we still haven't reached the point, I think, where Israeli Jews are capable of having that discussion on the whole. Some are, a small minority are, but they remain very much in a mindset where they claim that for their survival they need to have what they call a Jewish and democratic state, which means in effect a Jewish-dominated state where Jews have institutionalized privileges over others. And I think it will be difficult to talk about a transition until Israelis get to the point where they understand that the status quo is untenable. You can't have a situation of nightclubs and bikinis and thriving agriculture in Israel while people in Gaza are on the edge of destruction, that a society is really on the edge of destruction. There has to be a balancing out. There has to be a price for this. There has to be a price for the status quo. And what I proposed in the book, and what I think remains very much the best technology to bring Israelis to the point where they can consider making a quantum leap, as whites did in South Africa, they can consider a radical change in the way they think, is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I want to make sure to just show you, I'll put up some resources as I speak that you can go and look at later. Oh, I'm pressing the right button. Okay. For example, this is a site which, if you're not familiar with, you should note down. This is the website of the Boycott National Committee in Palestine. And the background here, very briefly, is that in 2005, I have to remember not to walk in front of the screen or the people with the cameras get mad at me, but my urge is to walk up to it. In 2005, hundreds of Palestinian civil society organizations, trade unions, community associations across the board in Palestinian society issued a call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Okay. And as you can see, there's, I think that Sean is BitTorrenting illegally music and stuff like that on the university network. I'm just kidding, because I think they sue, right? RIAA sue. If they see this video, you're in trouble. So that's just an excerpt from it there. We call for boycotts, divestment initiatives, embargoes, and sanctions. And these are aimed at three specific forms of injustice that Palestinians experience. And this is just a quick map to kind of give a quick sense of it. I've already talked about the situation in Gaza briefly, effectively a giant prison. In the West Bank, you have a situation of, we can actually probably get a better West Bank map. By the way, this is a great website for maps, pasia.org, the Palestinian Academic Society for, I don't remember what all the initials stand for, but there are great maps here. So that's why I don't like to use a PowerPoint. I prefer to use things that you can go away and look at yourself later in more detail. But if we just pick a, let's see. This one's sort of old, but I mean, things haven't changed that. It doesn't show the wall. But the point I want to make here is that the West Bank is broken up into these blue enclaves of Israeli settlers and the pink enclaves of Palestinians, and now the wall sort of makes it even more sliced and diced. So it's an effective system of apartheid that in a certain sense goes far beyond what was there in South Africa. In South Africa, you did not have whites-only roads, as you do in the West Bank with Jewish-only or settler-only roads. You have, of course, the really, it's not just sort of the physical distribution, but a form of legal apartheid in the sense of separate laws for separate people. So the settlers live under Israeli civil law. What does that mean? Is that if settlers are attacking Palestinians, as often happens, the army is not entitled to have any role can't stop them. So that's just like here. The army is not allowed to have any role in domestic law enforcement. The civilian police have to come. The Israeli civilian police never show up, or very rarely when Palestinians call them and say, settlers are attacking us. Palestinians are controlled by the army. They live under military law. Israeli Jews in the West Bank vote in Knesset elections, so they have a say in the government that actually governs the territory and makes that really holds the power over the situation. Palestinians have no such vote. So in every sense, you have a system of apartheid there. And then, of course, within the area on which Israel was established in 1948, this pink area, you have 1.5 million Palestinian citizens of Israel. You'll remember from the Size Doesn't Matter campaign that they stressed that Palestinians, or Arabs as they call them, serve in the Knesset and they vote. This is true, but they don't have any effective power or control over their own lives. In the 62 years of Israel's existence, an Arab party has never once been invited to participate in an Israeli coalition, which, and every government in Israel has been a coalition. You have the systematic land distribution, discrimination land distribution. You remember the Jewish National Fund, which we should pull up its website. Why not? I think it is jnf.org. And their mission here, again, note the greenwashing. Note the emphasis on it's a global environmental leader. There we have the 240 billion trees again. Parks, communities, and everything. Let's see, I think they have actually, this is interesting. They seem to have taken their mission off the website. This is very interesting. At least I can't see it here. It used to be right up front on the About page. But if you dig, you'll find it. And what they say is that their mission is to redeem the land of Israel for its owners, the Jewish people, and to hold it in trust for them in perpetuity. That's going to be somewhere on the website, but it's interesting that they've taken it off the main page and they're emphasizing the greenwashing message now. But what that means in practice is that the land, each one of these dots represents one, or this is some of the 500 Palestinian towns and villages whose populations were expelled or fled and not allowed to return in 1948, that their land was taken by Israel and given to the Jewish National Fund, which under its charter can only lease or sell land to Jews. So this is a mechanism for transferring land from the indigenous people to Jewish settlers, and Palestinian citizens of Israel have no right to go and settle the land. I want to show you another website because it's really quite remarkable. How do I get Google on this thing? It's a Google. Because this is Google Chrome, right? So it knows everything. I've never used it, and I use a Mac, so okay. So we'll type. That always gets but not round here. Okay, here we go. This I found was quite remarkable. Oops. We're looking for the Go North initiative. I saw it on the Google page. Let's see if I go back there. Let's just Google Go North. Oops. Now, this is a special initiative aimed at Jews in North America, Canada and the United States, to encourage them to move to northern Israel, which has, from the Israeli perspective, the worrying characteristic of having too many Arabs. And there was a panicked report in Haaretz the other day that 53% of the population in the Galilee is now Arab. We have to do something. So the response, one of the responses is Go North. And if you actually look at this, if you're an American or Canadian Jew, you can get all kinds of financial incentives and assistance to go and live in the Galilee. Of course, the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency would have an important role in this in allocating land taken from indigenous Palestinians, many of whom would live in refugee camps in Lebanon or Gaza or Syria or Jordan, and giving it to wealthy Canadians and Americans. And that's what the Jewish National Fund does, and that's really the basis of this system of racism. Now, if they want to populate the Galilee or the Negev, if they're worried that there's not enough people there, well, the easiest thing to do would be to allow Palestinian refugees to go home, who are only too eager to repopulate their lands and to begin to look after them and hold them in perpetuity for their owners. But the problem, of course, from Israel's perspective, is that these are unwanted humans. They're not valuable humans. The valuable humans are North American Jews. The useless humans are the people who have to be policed with remote control machine guns. And this is fundamental to understand. If Israel said that the people in Gaza or the refugee camps in the West Bank or elsewhere cannot return to their lands because they have the wrong skin color, everyone would understand that this is racism and apartheid. But Israel tries to mystify it by creating this sort of discourse about a Jewish state. But it's essentially the same because it's just as arbitrary. You don't choose whether you're born Palestinian, and in Israel's definition, you don't choose whether you're born Jewish. It's a racial or ethnic or even genetic definition. So I've strayed a bit because this was all to give you the background for the BDS call. But the BDS call calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctions initiatives and embargoes against Israel until 3 conditions are met. And that's why I wanted to give you the background. The first is an end to the racist denial of the right of return. The second is an end to the apartheid conditions, the systematic discrimination that Palestinian citizens of Israel live under. In other words, Israel must answer the call of Palestinian citizens that Israel become a state of all its citizens, instead of a state that privileges people based on their ethnicity. And third, of course, dismantling the system of occupation, military control, and apartheid in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So those are the 3 conditions that the BDS call asks for. it's not specifically or not explicitly a call for a single state. In theory, these conditions could be met in the context of two states. But what's important to understand is one of those states would not be a Jewish state giving special rights to Jews. Israel could remain, but it would have to be a state of all its citizens. So what I would argue is that if we get to a point where we can contemplate that, there's really no purpose to two states. You might as well recognize the existing binational reality, as Meron Benvenisti calls it, and begin to decolonize in the context of a single state. The technology of BDS is designed to increase the pain on Israel, to make the status quo untenable, and to get Israelis to the point where they're prepared to make these kinds of choices. When I say increase the pain, it's very different to the kind of pain Israel inflicts on Palestinians. Doesn't require a single Israeli child to skip a meal, doesn't require Israeli children to go to schools with their windows blown out because Israel bans the importation of glass into the Gaza Strip. But it does impose a moral, political, and economic cost on Israeli society that says if you choose not to change, you will be pariahs. And we know that this got South Africans to the point where they began to contemplate the change. In the last few minutes, I just want to talk about how that change happened in South Africa. One of the key objections that I get when I talk about single state, I get this question all the time, is, well, you know, you can talk about this pie in the sky, but Israeli Jews are against it by 95%, so why bother even talking about it? You have to be more pragmatic and more realistic. If those arguments had been made in the context of South Africa, what would have happened? Well, one question we should ask is, were whites in South Africa ready to embrace a one-person, one-vote system? How did that come about? When you actually go and look back at the surveys that were done at the time, very consistently, and right up until the very end, whites resisted the introduction of a one-person, one-vote system in quite remarkable numbers. Give you a couple of examples, although there are many. In 1990, and of course you'll remember, that was the year Nelson Mandela was released from prison. A survey of Afrikaners found that just 2.2% were prepared to contemplate a one-person, one-vote system with a universal franchise. A survey in 1988, and these are all published in academic journals. I'm happy to give you the references for them. In 1988, a survey of more than 400 white politicians, business leaders, media people, clergy, in other words, the elites, found that just 4.8% were prepared to accept a unitary state with a universal voting franchise, and 2/3 considered such an outcome unacceptable. And F.W. de Klerk, the last white president of South Africa, or apartheid president of South Africa, predicted in 1989 that a one-person, one-vote system would be the death knell of South Africa. It would result in a bloodbath that would consume tens or hundreds of thousands of lives. What we know is that the transition happened relatively smoothly, that there was a negotiated end, and that transition is ongoing. For many people, it's too slow. Decolonization is certainly incomplete. South Africa did not go from apartheid to utopia. It went from political apartheid to having a chance to decolonize peacefully. And that process is underway, and we don't know how it will end. And that possibility remains, I think, for Palestine, Israel. The thing I would like to end with before we go into the discussion is that some people will tell you that the kind of transition I'm talking about is impossible. What I would like to propose instead is that it's not impossible, but it's very, very, very difficult. But I think between impossible and very, very difficult, that is the space where hope and possibility still live and where we should be seeking them. Thank you. Can I comment on President Obama and his initiatives or lack thereof? Well, they're going to start indirect talks now, and the goal is to produce a two-state solution with two states living side by side in peace. And we can expect a Palestinian state in about 2 years' time. Why are you laughing? Here's a rule of the peace process, is that a Palestinian state will be established 2 years from now, whenever now is. So in 1999, it will be established 2 years from now. In 2015, it will be established 2 years from now. So a Palestinian state exists 2 years in the future at any given time. So all we need to do to get to the Palestinian state is invent a time machine, because then we can get there immediately without having to wait the 2-year period. But that's just a way to say that Obama's initiatives are, some of them are extremely significant and are having an enormous impact on the situation, and others are completely meaningless and a charade. The ones that involve negotiations and George Mitchell going backwards and forwards are totally meaningless. The ones that are having a real impact, of course, is the U.S. intervention, the continued, the Obama's pledge to provide Israel with $30 billion of military aid over the next 10 years, the continued intervention in Palestinian politics, where the Obama administration is continuing the Bush administration strategy of arming and funding Contra-like Palestinian militias to take on Hamas and other resistance groups. The Obama administration's support for the blockade of Gaza is a very significant intervention and very damaging. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers work in Egypt to supervise the construction of an underground wall to further besiege and immiserate the people in Gaza is a very significant Obama administration initiative. The former State Department official Aaron David Miller said a few years ago, he characterized the U.S. role in Middle East peace negotiations as being Israel's attorney. Increasingly, I think at that time it was Israel's, corporate lawyer. But increasingly now, the United States is acting as Israel's criminal defense attorney, with the mounting evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So the Obama administration's initiative to help spike and derail any legal accountability for Israel, particularly in the context of the Goldstone report, is certainly one, I think, that will cost lives. So that, I think, in sum, are the Obama administration initiatives. I hadn't heard that, but I think the strategy of Israel and the United States is to keep Gaza blockaded until any independent political resistance or military resistance is destroyed. That's their strategy. What they want is to build up the US and Israeli-backed Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and to eliminate any opposition to it. And Gaza is supposed to be the lesson to Palestinians, that if you support Hamas, this is what we'll do to you. So you'd better support our people. And of course, this is mirrored in the West Bank, which is, by the way, supposed to be the carrot. You know, Gaza is the stick. The apartheid in the West Bank is supposed to be the carrot. If the people in Gaza behave well and reject Hamas, they might get to live like the people in the West Bank. So I don't see that changing, unfortunately. I think what will make it change is when the cost of this policy becomes politically too high. And so I think the BDS movement is a very important tool. You know, for years we've been saying, write to your members of Congress, you know, do this sort of thing. I don't think that by itself makes any difference. But in the context of a growing BDS campaign, I think it does make a difference. Just look at how just a couple of weeks ago, 54 members of the House of Representatives signed a letter to Obama demanding he put pressure on Israel to lift the blockade of Gaza. There were, when AIPAC sponsored, or when an AIPAC drafted resolution, essentially, was put up before the House of Representatives a couple of months ago to condemn the Goldstone report, which investigated the war crimes, there were several dozen members of Congress, fewer voting for it than voted to support Israel's attack on Gaza a year before. I think these changes are significant, and what they demonstrate is that although the Israel lobby remains incredibly influential and powerful, it's not all powerful, and its grip is slipping. And the work that people are doing in the context of the BDS movement and other activism is starting to add up. You know, in Olympia, of course, you have Congressman Brian Baird, who has just been an incredible voice. It's amazing what he's done. It's very sad that he's not running for re-election. But that kind of discourse was unimaginable a couple of years ago. So the point I want to make is that left to their own devices, they would never lift the blockade of Gaza. But that doesn't mean it won't be lifted, because I think we can change the political context. I think that's really how I want to put it, yeah. Yes, the apartheid regimes attempt to control the movement of people. The tendency of humans is to mix. States don't like that. States hate it that people mix. They hate it that their citizens mix with non-citizens. They hate it if it's a racist state, if the races or ethnic groups mix with each other. And so they invest an enormous amount of effort into preventing humans doing what they tend to do, which is mix with each other. So even in Palestine, Israel, you have all sorts of mixing, but it becomes clandestine because the state is an apartheid state. So one of the arguments that's made about, you know, why South Africa is not a good analogy is that the apartheid regime was heavily dependent on black labor, and therefore the withdrawal of black labor struck a mortal blow to the economic basis of the regime. Well, that's true to some extent, and therefore in South Africa they had to tolerate blacks in the cities after trying to remove them, but to control their movement with the pass laws. So the pass laws said you could move in these areas to work, but you couldn't live in them, you couldn't stay overnight. And you had to go back to your designated area. Now we see something very similar developing in Israel, because in fact, Israel is still, and it's very hard to come by statistics on this because so much of it is clandestine. But most of the settlement construction is done by Palestinians. So Israel is very dependent on Palestinian labor to build the settlements. Much of the construction industry within Israel is dependent on Palestinians. Israel officially bans Palestinians from entering the country from the occupied territories, so they enter illegally. And there are actually networks of Israelis who work with Palestinians to smuggle the Palestinians into the country. And if you're caught without what's called an overnight stay pass, you go to jail or you pay a fine. So what you have developing there is a very similar system. You, of course, have segregated residential areas. But you also have pockets of mixing in cities like Haifa and others. This is fraying. I mean, if Israel were really an enlightened liberal state instead of an apartheid state, they would say, there in these cities have survived areas where Jews and Palestinians live as neighbors. Let's bring equality. Let's use that as the kernel or the seed from which we begin to grow a more just and integrated society. Instead, what Israel is doing is that me? Instead, what Israel is doing, or is allowing to happen, is the colonization of even those pockets of Palestinians surviving in cities that are now in Israel. So you may know that the film Ajami is up for an Oscar tonight. It's about a neighborhood in Jaffa, which is one of the few surviving indigenous neighborhoods in Jaffa, which Israel is now currently trying to ethnically cleanse within so-called sovereign Israel. The same is happening in Acre, in Akka in the north, where you have settlers actually moving from the West Bank. You know, so they went from Israel to the West Bank. Now they're moving from the West Bank to Akka in order to redeem or to conquer Akka from Palestinians living there. So you see a whole raft of state-sponsored and unofficial policies that are designed to create and entrench segregation. And all of it is governed by a strict system of laws and passes. Now, of course, all of this is so much more technological than South Africa. If apartheid South Africa had the sort of biometric technologies that Israel has, it's just frightening to think what they would have done with it. But Israel is now pioneering that. I don't agree at all that it's an exercise in futility. I think what would be an exercise in futility is waiting for the United States to change its policy. I think that you have to remember, in hindsight, everything looks much neater. So people say, for example, well, you know, opposing apartheid was a no-brainer. Who would have supported apartheid? Well, the question we really have to ask in hindsight is, if apartheid had so little support, how did it last so long? The answer is it had a great deal of support. The United States government supported the apartheid regime in South Africa, partly because of the Cold War, but there was also the same kind of culturalist identification that we see between the United States and Israel. The US opposed sanctions. You had a huge amount of business done with South Africa, with the energy, mining, gold, diamonds, uranium. You had a lot of interests that supported the apartheid regime. Consider that the first call from the ANC for boycott, divestment, and sanctions came in 1955, around the time the Freedom Charter was published, which called for South Africa for one person, one vote. It took until the mid-1980s until BDS became mainstream, until members of Congress felt ashamed if they didn't support it, and so on, and where trade unions started to take public stands on these issues. So it took a good 25 or 30 years. Compare and contrast that to now, where the Palestinian call came in 2005, and just 5 years later, this is becoming mainstream. So I think that things are happening much faster. I think that the thing to understand is that in terms of brute force, the material capacity to control things militarily, the South African regime was never threatened. Until the end, it maintained full military or physical force control over the situation. What changed was its moral legitimacy, its political legitimacy collapsed, and the cost of maintaining it politically, morally, and economically was growing exponentially. I think that Israel is vulnerable to that regardless of whether official US policy changes or not. And part of what we're seeing, of course, I was just in Canada, and this was all the talk of the people I was with and speaking to, and I spoke a lot about it there, that Israeli Apartheid Week was condemned in the Ontario Provincial Parliament. There is a resolution in the House of Commons to condemn Israeli Apartheid Week. The top political leaders have made statements claiming that criticism of Israel or likening Israel to apartheid is a form of anti-Semitism and so on. All this backlash, this would not be national news in Canada unless this were becoming a serious political issue and movement. So I take that, they're reactive. They don't have a message that can really counter the message of which I think, or we should be trying to push, of universal principles and justice and equality. Their methods to counter it can be categorized as greenwashing and gaywashing, which I talked about at length. So change the subject and put a nice face on it. Intimidation, so to try to bludgeon people into silence by threatening their funding or slandering them as anti-Semitic. And thirdly, to try to place Israel in a context of, a civilizational struggle, that Israel is simply fighting its corner in the global war on Islamic radicalism and the global war on terror. But I think none of these messages and methods really have legs. The greenwashing and gaywashing can be exposed very quickly, as I showed you tonight. The intimidation and bludgeoning works until enough people are fed up with it. And I think we're getting to that point where people are losing the fear to speak out about what Israel is doing. And I think people are getting tired of the whole civilizational warfare paradigm. There is a section in this country, whether it's the teabaggers or the whatever they're called, that love that message, and who, as much as I've criticized Barack Obama, we should all be horrified at the racism that has been directed against him, the shocking Islamophobia, and I think some of it is displaced racism, because there are certain things that even those racists know you can't say in America anymore, but you can still say them about Muslims. So that constituency is now very fertile for the pro-Israel message. So what you have now, I think, or what I perceive, I can't put numbers on it, it's somewhat impressionistic, is that support for Israel is shifting further and further to the right. And those are the people to whom Israel appeals. The post-1967 baby boomer generation that was impressed by Israel in the 1967 war, their kids are not buying it anymore. They're not signing on to this message. So who's left is the right-wing hardcore in this country that is now the natural constituency of support for Israel. So all of that's a very long way to say that I think the possibility of a radical break with the politics that we've seen in the past 30 or 40 years really exists. And it doesn't depend on the people at the top endorsing this message. It's a change that can happen despite them. Yes, I think people do have consciences, and I think that Israeli society is an example of a settler society that is reaching a point of decision where it has to decide to persist in a suicidal path, and a path that is destroying everyone around it. And it's not unique. We've seen this happen again in South Africa, in Northern Ireland. Unionists had to make a similar kind of decision. But part of the characteristic, and people have done studies of this, comparing these settler societies, is that one of the characteristics is that they're unable to perceive or empathize with those that the rest of the world views as being their victims. until they're made to do so. And so I don't know why that's the case. Partly it's fear. I mean, there are real fears Israelis have that if we give up power, what will happen to us? Will the tables be turned on us? Those legitimate fears should be recognized and addressed without indulging the racist demonization that those Palestinians or those Africans are less civilized than us. They will slaughter us the moment they get the chance and so on. So I think there's a specific kind of settler psychosis that has to be understood and treated. And BDS is the right treatment for it. And by the way, you already see the beginnings of this kind of introspection within Israeli society. You know, every day in the Israeli press, there are more articles about BDS, and it's having the effect that it's supposed to. It's forcing Israelis to ask questions about what Israel is doing that they would rather ignore, that if they could get away with ignoring it, they would. So the second question, or the first question rather, about discrimination among Jews, I mean, just very briefly, of course, Israeli Jewish society is a segmented society and a racially segmented society. And a very good chapter to read on this is Joseph Meshad's chapter in his book, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, on Israel's internal other. The internal other was the Arab Jews, what came to be called Mizrahim, who Israel welcomed reluctantly because they needed warm bodies. You know, if you're going to have a Jewish majority, you need warm bodies. I mean, one of the myths of Israel that it tries to propagate is that the Jews need Israel. It's always been the other way around. Israel needs Jews, whether from North America or Argentina, whatever. Let's, you know, go north, the Go North campaign, for example. So these Jews were brought reluctantly, and they were treated by the European Ashkenazi elite very much the way Southern European immigrants were treated in this country, for example, by the white elites in this country, until they integrated and were considered white. The process in Israel is that the Mizrahim became, in a sense, the foot soldiers of the most extreme Israeli politics. Although there was incredible resistance, the Black Panthers in Israel, who were modeled on the Black Panthers here, were an Arab-Jewish effort to effectively resist Zionism from within. Today, this is something that's not well known. The majority of Jews in Israel are of Arab origin, something over 50%. It's somewhere between 50 and 60%. The majority of Israeli Jews are of Arab origin. And so I think when you think outside Zionism, or you think of after Zionism, one of the attractive possibilities to me is the idea of Arab Jews being able to reintegrate into the Arab world. Because what Zionism did was it cut them off from the Arab world. It made Jew and Arab a dichotomy, you know. So David Shipler wrote that book a few years ago. He was one of the New York Times correspondents in, you know, it was called Arab and Jew. Those were once the same thing. So also I think an end to the Zionist setup offers possibilities of really radical transformation within what is now considered a monolithic Israeli society. So to me, that's a very attractive notion. I'm sorry, one more thing on this. A few weeks ago, Netanyahu said that Israel is the only country, only first world country in the world that borders on the third world. And this was in the context of announcing that Israel was going to build a fence along the entirety of its border with Egypt. And he explicitly, this is to keep out African migrants who come up from Africa, as they have for, you know, thousands of years, into the Middle East, and he said this is necessary to protect Israel's status as a first world country and its Jewish character. And Egypt, to spare Israel the embarrassment, has been doing the policing of African migrants as well, not just of the Palestinians. So this is barely reported. It's a scandal, but it's barely reported that many of them are refugees who are coming, they claim asylum or whatever in Israel. Egypt is shooting them dead in the Sinai. And so far this year, 8 African migrants have been shot dead by Egypt for trying to cross the border into Israel. So that also is part of the extreme racialization of the Jewish state as a white first world civilization surrounded by barbarians who have to be caged, shot, policed, controlled, and so on. That's a very good question. I'm going to see if I can find a map. This is a 2006 map showing the route or the proposed route of the wall. There are slight differences in the actual path, and most of this southern part has not actually been built. So it has been built around here, around the city of Qalqilia, and then these sections deep into the West Bank, and I think from around here down it hasn't quite been built yet. The first argument that it's a security barrier would be more convincing if Israel built it on the 1967 line. But Israel has built it in such a way as to annex large areas of land and actually is building settlements in those annexed areas. So it seems to be about annexing land. The second thing is that we know that Palestinians, that this border is is very porous. I mean, it does make movement much harder for a lot of Palestinians. And in the village of Bil'in, there are the weekly demonstrations that have become emblematic of the larger nonviolent resistance because the wall is taking up so much of the village lands there. But what we've seen is that Palestinians who are determined to cross it can do so. First of all, much of the southern section hasn't been built and actually has stopped in a way. The Israelis are not really building it with the same vigor they used to. And you can pay Israelis to let you go across the border. That's what some of the smuggling networks that were uncovered recently have shown. So the real explanation for why the suicide bombing stopped is because the Palestinian groups that were conducting them made a political decision to stop them. They abandoned that tactic, which is a very good thing. It was a very bad tactic. And they understood that in addition to the moral cost of it, it was politically devastating to Palestinians. So that's the real reason why the suicide bombing stopped, not because of the war.
Specifically Hamas made this stand to no longer do suicide bombing?
Correct. And they effectively took it let's say a year before the election, around 2005. They did carry out a few bombings after that, but those seem to have been something of an aberration. The policy was to stop it. And in fact, they have more or less stuck to that. The first question, there is tremendous indigenous and internal resistance and activism, particularly among Palestinians inside Israel. And they have actually been in the forefront of defining and articulating a vision for the future. In 2007, leaders of the Palestinian community in Israel published a series of documents that kind of came collectively to be known as the Future Vision documents. And one of them was a democratic constitution, a draft of a democratic constitution for Israel. Another is called the Haifa Declaration. There's one called the Future Vision of the Arabs in Israel. You can find them online. I've also written about them. And they were quite participatory. There is a body in of Palestinians in Israel called the Arab Higher Committee, which brings together all the elected representatives of Palestinians in Israel, so mayors, local councillors, members of the Knesset, and so on. It's not officially recognized by Israel. So that and other processes were used to generate these visions. And in a sense, they represent in the most advanced thinking about what the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis can be in a democratic and equal society. I think that what has happened rather is that the struggle of Palestinians in Israel has been marginalized and ignored by the broader, by the Palestinian leadership certainly of the PLO. But one of the things the Re'ut Institute warned about was the internationalization of the Palestinians, of the situation of the Palestinians in Israel. In other words, the danger to Israel is that the rest of the world might notice and take seriously what is happening to Palestinians in Israel and might begin to support their political demands for equality. So that's as far as that's concerned. As far as in the other parts of the Palestinian community, I think it's true that for Palestinians it has been extremely difficult as compared with, say, the South African struggle to develop a unified vision and leadership. And in fact, the whole Oslo process set up Palestinians to compete with each other. It set the West Bank and Gaza against the diaspora. And really contradicted the rights of the diaspora, the right of return in particular. So, and of course ignored Palestinians in Israel. So part of our challenge now is to begin to re-articulate a vision that expresses the rights and needs of all Palestinians, and does so in a way that I think can be done while doing justice to Israeli Jews in a post-Zionist state. So the BDS call does that. It talks not just about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, as the peace process did, but it includes Palestinians in Israel, and it includes the right of return for the diaspora. We don't have mechanisms now. The PLO is finished. I mean, it's an empty shell. Apparently they met yesterday and approved the indirect talks, but I don't know who they are. They don't represent me, although I'm told they're the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But in fact, it doesn't operate, the PLO. And so this makes it very difficult to express and articulate a legitimate vision. But nonetheless, we see a lot of decentralized leadership emerging. The BDS movement is Palestinian-led and is led from within. You see the nonviolence movement. Israel has given incredible recognition to the leaders of the resistance in Bil'in and Budrus and Jayus and other villages by arresting and jailing them for advocating and practicing nonviolence. And nonviolence sounds all, namby-pamby and nice, but you take your life in your hands when you practice nonviolence against Israel, because their response is always violent. It takes incredible courage and self-sacrifice, and we see that leadership developing as well. So there's no easy answer as to where that leadership, will a single figure emerge. Maybe we're beyond the point where, we need a single great man. But let's recognize the tremendous leadership that does exist pretty much everywhere you find Palestinians. The second question was, what sustains the, I'm going to rephrase it as what sustains the conflict. Is it the same today as it was 62 years ago? I would say yes. It remains. The core issues remain, and they have not been addressed. The dispossession of the Palestinians and their demand for justice. That's remained the core. Of course, with so much animosity over so much time, the wounds run pretty deep. And again, we've seen that in other societies. So in addition to bringing justice, you also have to start thinking about how you undo those wounds as well. And different societies have used different ways through reforming education systems, truth and reconciliation processes, trials of perpetrators. There are all sorts of different models out there and things that have to be done simultaneously to begin to change that dynamic to one that is more healthy. I didn't take the questions as cynical, and I think that that we all struggle with these issues to a certain extent, because many of us have been doing this work for many, many years and feel overwhelmed by the fact that, you know, things in so many respects seem to be getting worse all the time. Look at the inflated hopes in this country with the election of Obama, or at least the end of the Bush administration, and how deeply disappointing that has been to so many people. I think that we have to recognize that that can have a demoralizing effect on people. So I didn't take it as cynicism. But there are a lot of reasons to be very hopeful. I think that when you look at how heavily the odds have been stacked against people on this issue of Palestine, the resources that have gone into silencing debate in our universities, that have gone into buying the silence and complicity of politicians, the fear in the mainstream media to report on this issue and address it honestly. There have been tremendous mechanisms to exclude and marginalize this discussion, and more than that, to distort it, to dehumanize Palestinians in particular, but also more broadly other victims and targets of US imperialism, whether in Iraq or Pakistan or Afghanistan, now Yemen and Somalia, in the context of the so-called war on terror, that despite all that, we see a shift. And we see, you know, one of the things that struck me when I was in Spokane and Portland and some of the more, you know, off the beaten track places was people said to me, well, you know, we're just out here in these little towns. Do you think this makes a difference? And I actually think it's more important than what happens in the so-called hubs, in a sense, because, you know, nobody is surprised that there are events like this in Seattle or in Chicago or New York or Washington. But I think when the supporters of Israeli apartheid see BDS campaigns cropping up in Spokane, Washington, and Victoria, British Columbia, that's when they know they've lost control of the narrative. And so, in a sense, I feel really more hopeful about this than ever, that what we do really can and does make a difference. That things, particularly since the Israeli wars in Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza in 2008, the receptivity on this issue is just incredible. And I think the other aspect that's really contextual is the loss of confidence in the institutions that we have in this country and globally. That with the financial and economic crisis, and so much of, you know, it turned out that so much of the economy was smoke and mirrors, with the endless and escalating wars, with the fact that, you know, we have a $1.5 trillion deficit, but we can still afford $800 billion for the Pentagon. I mean, some of that anger gets channeled into things like the Tea Party. But I think an even larger part is being channeled into openly questioning and moving towards a more progressive response. So I don't think there's any need for cynicism. There's a lot of, it's daunting, the challenge, but there's a lot of possibility. And to the final comment to the gentleman there, I appreciate the sentiment of what you're saying, but I think part of responding to the need is not to try to redefine things our own way, but to start with how people define themselves. I don't think Palestinians are going to stop calling themselves Palestinians and that also includes Muslim and Christian Palestinians, and Israeli Jews identify pretty strongly with their identity, so they start there. The campaign that I think we have to, my view, the most effective way to support the sort of vision you're describing is to support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, because it starts with the recognition that there is a tremendous power imbalance. Israelis have this much power and Palestinians have this much power. So you can't be neutral between them. You have to stand, you have to change that power equation to the point where a real dialogue can happen. Dialogue can only happen between equals. And what BDS does is it works to create the conditions for a genuine dialogue. Not a fake dialogue like we have with the peace process, but one between equals that can really bring an end to this. And I think that possibility is really within our grasp, within not the next 30 or 50 or 100 years, but within the next 5, 10 years. And the urgency to me is great, because I believe that the Palestinians, our parents and grandparents, who left in 1948, deserve to see justice in their lifetimes. And that's something that's still within our grasp. Thank you.